not clear what he's referring to. If he's referring to the Council of Constantinople 879, for example, which I think is what he's probably referring to, that council, it's kind of shrouded in some uncertainty. It doesn't even get numbered by significant representatives on either the Latin or the Greek side for centuries after the 9th century. And so it becomes a question as to what value does that synod have, first of all, right? I mean, Ephesus 431, Nicaea 1, Chalcedon, all these councils, whether they had difficulties, tensions, problematic interruptions, whatever you want to pull on top of it, they were all began to be numbered right away as an ecumenical council. So the fact that Constantinople 879, which forbade worded.
Okay, Father.
Yes, well, I just wanted to point about this numbering of the Eighth Ecumenical Council, or Council 879 to 80. Now, that council does call itself ecumenical. It calls itself an ecumenical council, and it is pretty much formally recognized in 1484 when they speak of 8 ecumenical councils. So there was a awareness of that council being the 8th Ecumenical Council in the 15th century, and probably before that. Now, I just wanted to point out, he says all the councils were numbered straight away. Well, he himself argues that the Second Ecumenical Council was only a local council, and so it wasn't sort of even recognized officially at the Third Ecumenical Council, though it was recognized in the Fourth Ecumenical Council 20 years later. So, and Leo himself, the Great, Pope Leo the Great, some popes Leo the Great, he questioned it or didn't take its value as highly as perhaps he should have or could have. So the Second Ecumenical Council wasn't immediately numbered, as he said, but took the evidence. There was a little bit of time before it was commonly and universally recognized as such, as 70 years later. So that a council is not immediately recognized does not mean it's not ecumenical. No one will question the ecumenacy of the Second Ecumenical Council now, although some people trying to apply certain rules would say start questioning it. But all the fathers recognized the Second Ecumenical Council, despite it really being an Eastern council at the time, due to certain constraints of its calling, was nevertheless and is recognized as the Second Ecumenical Council. So he's not been quite correct on that point, that the councils were immediately numbered as such. No, they weren't. And you'll also find that the Seventh Ecumenical Council was reaffirmed at the Council 879 to 880 as being an ecumenical council. So there is a way in the church that a preceding council is sometimes held in a slight state of uncertainty or lacking of definite numbering until the next one comes and affirms it as being the continuation of the teaching of the church and continuation and at correct ecumenical council. Not that that council only takes authority then. The council has an authority immediately it is completed, because it's the Holy Spirit speaking through the fathers. It's Christ himself teaching through the council. And so the authority of the council is immediately that of Christ. And as the fathers are inspired by the Holy Spirit, Christ is in the midst of them and speaking through the fathers. It is the authority of God that these councils have once they are completed. But there's a distinction between that and that we have to test the prophets, and occasionally not all so-called ecumenical councils are necessarily that of God. And so it takes some time for us to come to a certainty that it is that of God, which is usually something where it's not challenged for about 50 years. Then we can be pretty sure that it is of God, assuming all the other aspects of being an ecumenical council, being called by an emperor, being called as an ecumenical council, being at least by calling representative of all the churches. It doesn't actually have to be an actual composition representative of all the churches, but at least in calling or in the case of Ecumenical Council, it was called as Eastern Forum of a dual council, which was going to have a Western Forum, but the Western Forum never happened through various circumstances. But nevertheless, because it was called as intended to be part of a wider dual council as ecumenical, it takes a council ecumenical, even though it is not necessarily fully represented in this ecumenical sense for everyone to know. That doesn't matter. It's a call is there, and the faith was, and it was accepted in the West as being true, and it was intended to have a Western thing. God just didn't bring that about according to his will. And so there is a case of councils. There's a council 869, which was called, the Roman Catholics call it ecumenical. So it was clearly had a sense of it was ecumenical, but it was rejected and cast aside by the Council 879. The later council therefore was ecumenical in the same level to renounce the previous ecumenical council, so-called ecumenical council. And that has never been challenged since then by the churches, until the schism, where it became a problem for the Western Church. It stands there really very strongly pointing to the equality of Rome and New Rome, Rome and Constantinople, even though it gives a certain priority to the elder Rome over against Constantinople. It very much strongly points to their equality in its canons, and also it's very strong in reinforcing a prohibition against the creed. But we'll talk about that, adding to the creed, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I just really wanted to mention that the fact that the Eighth Ecumenical Council has not, at this stage, maybe been formally recognized, or that we don't sort of talk about eight ecumenical councils when you ordain bishops in our standard literature, that doesn't mean that there isn't an Eighth Ecumenical Council. And so he's casting more aspersion on this council than I think is warranted by the evidence. And so we can't, and it's not correct to talk about them immediately being numbered, the Second Ecumenical Council being the case in point.
So, Father, as far as the Filioque, like, what is the importance of this 879 council?
Well, the 879 council is reflecting on the innovation or the interpolations of the Franks, and it's basically reinforcing what is said at the Third Ecumenical Council, the Fourth Ecumenical Council, and it sort of explicitly says, I think it's even Fifth and Sixth, you might find references to this, where they continually say you cannot change the creeds of the council, you can't add to them, you can't remove from them, you can't modify them. And it's just reinforcing it, but it's specifically and very strongly making this point as its declaration of faith, that we cannot change. And this is specific in reference to the Council of Constantinople. The Third Ecumenical Council is very more specific in reference to the Council of Nicaea, but it's the same principle because it's the same inspiration of the same creeds by the Holy Spirit. It's because they're inspired by the Holy Spirit that they cannot be changed. That would be denied the perfection of the creed at the time of the council, which would be an insult and blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. So that is the basic line. This is reinforced through all the councils that these things are not changed, added to, subtracted from. And so this Eighth Ecumenical Council, because the Franks started doing this interpolation, came down heavily against that and ruled very strongly that was a blasphemy. Anyone who does such will be cut off from the church, trying to squash this interpolation. Sadly, the Franks didn't ignore that, and the churches ended up splitting 150 years, 200 years later in a formal sense. But yes, that was the council was trying to reinforce that we do not change the creed. So it wasn't arguing about the Filioque, but it was definitely due to interpolations, as saying you cannot change the creeds, even if it is good and holy, because they are inspired by the Holy Spirit and are perfected in themselves. As an example, I could say we don't change the Gospel of Mark and start adding bits of a Gospel of Luke into it or a Gospel of John into it to make it more perfect. We leave each Gospel in itself. We reconcile it. We write extra tetragrams on the side and saying how they're reconciled, etc. occasionally scribes do get a little bit away on themselves and do little small changes. But overall, we don't go and change one gospel with bits of the other and try to make some sort of hybrid gospel as self. I mean, they each stand in itself, and because each is inspired by the Holy Spirit. Who are we to say that the Holy Spirit failed to put the perfect gospel to that writer as he intended it through that writer, and start saying, "Oh, we want to improve it by what we think is better"? No, that's obviously means we're confused and putting our opinion ahead of that of the Holy Spirit. And it's basically blasphemy, because the Holy Spirit is who inspired it. And if we're trying to say that it's missing, lacking, or any imperfect, then we are blaspheming against the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and the fact that they reinstated St. Photius at that council, his main issue was the Filioque. So you can see like the theme of that council, being St. Photius, but you can tie the Filioque in with him in that. So you can see that was the context of what they were saying, as far as that you couldn't change the creed, right?
Yes. But they didn't specifically just focus on that. The general principles, you cannot change a creed for any reason. And so they just leave it at that as a general prohibition against adding, subtracting, modifying the creed in any way. That includes adding the words Filioque. But yeah, it wasn't directly saying you cannot put the word Filioque in the creed. It was the determination. Spirit decided that the better principle is the whole principle, not changing at all. Not just that whether this or that specific change can happen. You just don't modify the creed in any way, but including obviously the Filioque. So the broader principle is no changes of the creed for the reasons I've given. And that's what the council held. And that's perfectly consistent with the Third Ecumenical Council. I think the Fourth almost says exactly the same thing again. Fifth and Sixth, I'm not sure if all of them say it, but I know it's at least repeated at least one or two of the other councils explicitly, that we don't change creeds.
Yeah, in this council, it had like somewhere around 400 bishops. It was represented by all five patriarchs and ratified by all the patriarchates, including Rome. And I think it was accepted by Rome for at least 200 years before it was even questioned.
Yes, that's right. It's only for modern things that we just talk about 7 ecumenical councils and stuff. For one reason or another in our ordinations, I don't know exactly why. It's sort of a sense of a number of perfection that anyone can raise a doubt whether it's actually an ecumenical council. But apart from that, there's no question, I think, at any stage until the schism that it was an ecumenical council. It called itself that. It ticks all the boxes of what an ecumenical council should be, the representation, calling by the emperor, and its canons are recognized by the Orthodox Church to this day. They're included in the body of canons. But they're sort of given first place among the local ones. It sort of still, in a sense, sits partly unaffirmed as prior 7 ones. But in all practical sense, it's always been accepted as Eighth Ecumenical Council. But I think there's a sense that we talk about the 7 ecumenical councils, and I wouldn't push it absolutely everyone that they have to accept it as the 8th Ecumenical Council as a sort of to be orthodox. But in all practical sense, yes, it is recognized. It was recognized by everybody as such. And I think Erick's been a little bit too fudging on this council, but of course he would do, because the West has sort of tried to push it out of the way and restate the Council 869 as being the ecumenical council, because it suits their purposes better. But that one was overturned and annulled by 879, which again, for 150 odd years, 200 years, that will sustain a position east and west.
Yeah, and I hear there was even a council in 920 that cites this council as authoritative and ecumenical.
It could be. I don't know that one, but I wouldn't be surprised. As I said, I can't see any reason why it wouldn't be recognized as ecumenical. It's just we in the modern times have got used to talking about the 7 ecumenical councils. So people go, "Oh, then how I got this 8th one if you talk about 7." Okay, well, leave that argument out. But as far as all the other evidence and reasons to be for it to be ecumenical. I think it can be, and there's plenty of evidence that suggests that it was understood by that after it's been held in a number of places. It's not just sort of a modern thing or a self-ascribed ecumenicity, which nobody recognized at all afterwards. We're not talking about that. It's one that you can see definite recognition of it as such. There, even if we talk about the 7 ecumenical councils today, and limit ourselves in a way to those 7. Okay, we do, but that is not to exclude its place as ecumenical. And I think, as I say, Erick's arguments against it, I don't think are supported by its reception afterwards.
Yeah, and even St. Mark of Ephesus at Florence refers to it as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. So.
Yeah, that's right. The actual Council of Constantinople, 1484, also refers to it as the Eighth Ecumenical Council.